All right, so we are into Unit 5, and we are going to look at Chapter 27, which is the nervous system, and then it also gets into our 5 senses and interplay with muscle and skeleton. So it's a bit of a crazy chapter in my opinion. I feel like it covers so many different things, and it gets into a lot of details, especially with vision and the senses and things. So with this Skype, I'll kind of point out what might be, the biggest things to focus on within the chapter, because I find this chapter can kind of bog people down a little bit. Sound good? And then I have, I don't know, I think I have 10 or 11 review questions at the end that we can look at. So it is fairly early in the unit. Sometimes I'm not sure whether it's better to do a Skype session early or later, but with March break next week and whatnot, so I figured we'd better get it done this week. So some of the review questions you might not have any idea if you haven't looked at it yet, so that's okay. You can sit there and grab your book or open your book and try your best, and if you don't know, then it's recorded, so you can come back and peek at it a second time to see if you can get the answers a second time after you reviewed the material. All right, so let's get going. So I started right off with a question. So basic kind of organization of our nervous system as humans. So 2 main divisions are, so the first 2 divisions. And now CNS, if you see that, stands for central nervous system, and PNS is peripheral nervous system. Diana said D, and she is correct. Those are the 2 main divisions, central and peripheral nervous system. And that's kind of the graphic that shows that. So the yellow pieces, the brain and the spinal column there, that would be your central nervous system. And then all of the other black nerves coming off of the yellow pieces are the peripheral. So central, brain and spinal cord, peripheral, all the other nerves that go out to our extremities and organs. So this is a kind of a neat, I like this graphic in that it really nicely sums up what we are looking at in our nervous system. So if you start up, and I think if I remember correctly in your book, it actually has the stimulus as being, let me just grab a pen here. So right here we have some part of our sensory system that's detecting some kind of stimulus. So here it's using sight as an example. In your textbook, I think it might use a mosquito biting your skin. So there's all kinds of different ways that our nervous system can receive a stimulus. And so if we are outside, like anywhere else in our body other than our brain and spinal cord, we are technically part of the peripheral nervous system. So here you're going to find our sensory neurons. So we go from our stimulus, our neurons pick this up and bring it to our brain. So sensory neurons are still part of your peripheral nervous system. Then we get to this green area, which is all of our central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord, like it says down here. And so once that stimulus has reached our brain, that's where integration happens. So it's kind of just our brain making sense of what the heck just happened and then deciding what needs to happen as a response. So in this example, it shows them seeing something. So maybe they saw, I don't know, my kids are really into being afraid of clowns at the moment, so maybe this person saw a scary clown. The nerve sent that message to the brain. It gets here to be integrated and made sense of in the brain. And then for this person, the brain decided they need to run. So it sends out a signal back out to the peripheral nervous system through our motor neurons, and here it's stimulating our muscle to move and run. Now, in the example of the mosquito biting your skin, the sensory neurons take that sensation to our brain. Our brain makes sense of what's happening, so it detects that it's something on your skin that probably shouldn't be. It sends out that output to our through our motor neurons, and you're probably going to slap that mosquito away. So all that stuff happens very, very quickly. It's very efficient, but that is how it's organized. And if you have any questions, please just write over there and ask away, or use your mic, whatever works best for you. I think someone else might have joined here. Let me just make sure I have everybody so you get your points. Here, Kim, Mary. No, I think I got everybody. All right, so neurons. So this is the this is the cell that's going to be carrying all the electrical signals from one part of your body to another. So this is, they do look, some of them look different, but this is a basic kind of depiction of a neuron that would include all of the different pieces. So, for example, some neurons might have a very, very short axon. Some might have a very, very long one. Some might not even appear to have much of an axon, so they might look different, but this is a basic kind of setup. So the way an electrical signal passes through a neuron, so somewhere up here, you're going to have a stimulus, so it could be that mosquito biting your skin. It always, all of these little tree-like guys up here around the cell body are called dendrites. So the signal was always accepted in through these dendrites, and you see these red arrows traveling that signal down toward the cell body. So it's picked up here, enters through the dendrites, passes through the cell body, and down out here through the axon. So again, this is going to vary by length. Some of them will run almost the entire length of our bodies, and some of them are very short. So it passes through the axon until it reaches the end here. And here at the end is where you'll find synaptic terminals. So this is kind of the space between the neuron, or the end of the neuron, and the next cell. So that electrical signal, it has to pass somewhere, so it's going to be passing out across these synaptic terminals to another cell. So it could be a receiving cell, like a muscle cell in your leg, or it could be another neuron, so it could continue passing to another neuron as well. I see someone's typing. I'll just wait a second in case there's a question before I move from there. Okay, what does it say? Does the cell body just serve to keep the nerve alive, or does it play a larger role in the transfer of the signal? Well, the cell body, it's pretty much where it has all the nucleus, so all of the genetic material for the cell, and all of the organelles. So it is primarily just for the cell to live, but without it, the way it is still structured around the outside, like those dendrites are so interconnected with it that it would play some kind of role, right? But it's technically like the cell body, the same as any other cell in your body. Does that answer your question? Okay. So let's move into action potential. So this can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around sometimes, But we'll go through it, and I have a couple of review questions that might help you kind of get it straight and what to focus on. So here's a question to start. The action potential is, so this is talking about, has to do with sending a signal through a neuron and how it actually works. So the action potential is any factor that generates a nerve signal to be generated, that causes a nerve signal to be generated. Is it a stimulus of sufficient strength which can trigger a nerve signal that carries information along a neuron, or C, only found in the brain? Anybody have any ideas? If you haven't really reviewed action potential and stuff yet, it might sound very foreign. No, Diana said B, and that's correct. So action potential is just that a nerve has been stimulated with enough strength in order to actually be triggered, and then that nerve signal will carry the information along the neuron. So if you think about it as, what's on my next slide here? Yeah, so if you think about it as a flashlight, if you only press the button a tiny bit, the light's not going to come on. It has to be pressed with sufficient strength in order for the light to turn on. And so that's kind of similar to how the neuron's working. There has to be significant stimulus in order for that signal to continue being passed along the neuron. So how does this work? So a neuron, so up here in the top, do I still have a pen here? It shows that basic diagram that we looked at with a neuron. Then it's showing a piece of this axon. So think of this here as an axon. And like all of our cell membranes, there's going to be differently charged ions on either side of it. So there's a stimulus that happens. Before there's even a stimulus, the membrane, so that cell membrane, is going to be at its resting potential, meaning that it's all positively charged outside and negatively charged inside. So resting potential is just how it is all the time without a stimulus happening to it. And then, so some kind of stimulus happens, so it's going to trigger just a few of those ion channels to open. So a few of those positive ions are going to enter the inside part of the neuron. So, and then if the stimulus is strong enough, sorry, I was slightly distracted there. My dog came into the room. So, and then if the stimulus is strong enough, then it's going to reach a certain threshold, which is going to cause a flood of kind of those positive ions to move in. And as that moves in, it's going to move its way along the axon. So it's very technical in how it all works. But we'll review it a little bit again here. I think I have a better... So if you come into this slide and memorize this, you should be fine. So as far as, how the start of a nerve signal happens, so number one, the stimulus happens, like a fly lands in your skin. What happens next is a small number of positive ions rush inside the cell membrane. Action potential is reached, so enough of those rushed in that action potential has been reached. And then number 4 is more positive ions continue to rush into the cell membrane. And then after that signal passes along, the membrane returns to resting potential again. So sometimes this slide, if you go and take it and match it up and look at your book or a neuron or whatever, that might help when you're studying, for some of you anyway. The book does a pretty okay job of describing it, but it can be, I find, a sticky point for some students. So any questions on that? So passing a signal from a neuron to a receiving cell. So I just kind of touched on this. So when action potential reaches the end of the neuron, so it's reached the end, what happens? Does it end its transmission so the nerve signal no longer continues? It connects to the dendrites of the receiving cell, so the next cell would take up, the dendrites on it would pick up that signal, or it gets to the end and then it must pass across the synaptic cleft, or it will reverse its direction and go back up the axon. Any guesses? Diana guessed C, and she's good at guessing because that is correct. So it must pass across the synaptic cleft. So if it's going to another neuron, it will then go to more dendrites to a receiving cell. But a receiving cell wouldn't necessarily be there. A receiving cell wouldn't necessarily have dendrites, especially if it was a muscle cell or something. Only if it was going to another neuron would that be the case. So this is showing that communication that happens along that synaptic cleft. So I talked about reaching the end of a nerve, like it's showing it right here. It's reaching the end of one neuron and moving to the other. So in between that is this little space right here called the synaptic cleft. And so how does it jump across from one to another? So in this example, it's through a neurotransmitter. So it does it chemically. So it gives off a chemical signal that passes to the next cell that then continues that action potential along the next one. So this looks very confusing, but what I just told you is good enough to know. Okay, so the central nervous system, so going back to kind of dividing up how our nervous system, or what it looks like, central nervous system consists of what? The brain, the spinal cord, both of the above, or the sensory neurons. Oh, Chrissy, you're here. I didn't notice. Welcome. I'll write you down. C, that is correct. The brain and the spinal cord. All right. Oh, well, I'm glad you made it. It's recorded, so what you missed, or I'll say, fingers crossed, it's recording correctly, and you'll get to check in with what you missed. Okay, so the brain. So in your textbook, it has a diagram of the brain, and it kind of gives some examples of what each part does. So I'm always a bit conflicted on... Traditionally, this course has tested a little bit about different parts of the brain. So in general, it is good to look at that. Like the cerebral cortex is a pretty big factor, or a pretty big player as far as, you know, a lot of what makes us human, really. So things like being able to do math or language skills, being artistic, or your personality is going to come from that piece. The cerebellum down here, that's this guy. It's good for body movement. The hypothalamus is a big player, and we'll look at him again in the endocrine system as well. But all this talk about homeostasis, our hypothalamus is a big player in keeping homeostasis in a lot of different parts of our body. And then we look at pieces of the brain stem down here, like the pons. So these are very basic kind of things that our body does, like controlling our breathing. Parts of the midbrain here are more, reflexes and medulla oblongata right here. So that's, again, breathing, but also circulation, digestion, swallowing. So brainstem is kind of those basic involuntary needs that our our body takes care of. So there are some basic things you should probably know about the brain, and I'll give you some review questions at the end to help you zero in on what piece is there, because you could get totally bogged down in all of it. Okay, so if we start to look at the peripheral nervous system, let me make sure I'm following you along here. Fine, okay. So the output component of the peripheral nervous system, so again we have central, brain, and spinal cord. Peripheral is everything outside of your brain and spinal cord. It's going to be divided into two components. Any guesses which two? Or look in your book. If many of you even have a paper copy of your book, I think a lot of you use online, don't you? So yeah, it is divided into, yeah, online's cheaper. Yep. And it is divided, A is the correct answer, so peripheral nervous system is divided into our motor system. So those are the signals going to our skeletal muscles, and it's voluntary, meaning we can control it. And then the other piece is the autonomic nervous system, which kind of regulates things like smooth muscle in our digestive system or cardiac, like our heart. So those are involuntary things we can't. So the answer there was A. And so here's what we have so far. If you like these kind of diagrams, starting off with our nervous system, we divided into the central and the peripheral. So the central nervous system was made up of our brain and our spinal cord. And so for our peripheral nervous system, we've divided into our motor system, so the voluntary things that we can control with our muscles, and then autonomic, which are things we can't control. And then we're going to divide one more time into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So if you're studying in your textbook, coming back to this slide right here could be helpful, because it can start to get all a bit muddled in your head, or even just drawing it out yourself can help get it into your memory as well. So we're going to divide one more time into parasympathetic and sympathetic. Oh, this is just another showing like motor, muscle, and autonomic. All right, let me see. Okay, senses. All right, so just to touch on, so dividing that autonomic system into parasympathetic and sympathetic. So there are two contrasting things that our body goes to. Parasympathetic is also known as a rest and digest, and heal as well. So that's another rest, digest, and heal. So our immune system works better in that parasympathetic state as well. If you're into things like meditation or yoga, you've probably heard about activating your parasympathetic system, and it's totally true. Under this rest and digest, you're going to have a decrease in your heart rate. You are going to have an increase in your digestive organs working. You will have a decreased breathing rate. And also your immune system is able to function properly to heal things or to fight illness. Now, in contrast to that, we have this sympathetic division. So the sympathetic nervous system, and it is going to be the opposite. So this is known as fight or flight. So when this is stimulated, so if you're really scared, your body doesn't have to worry about things like if you need to run from that clown that you saw earlier, your body doesn't have to worry about digesting food necessarily. So your digestive system is actually going to slow down and not work as well. Your immune system is going to kind of take a back seat, because, getting away from whatever's scaring you or fighting whatever's scaring you is primary over, fighting an illness at that time or healing. So you're going to have an increased heart rate. So it's exactly opposite. Increased heart rate, increased breathing patterns, And then your body's also going to start giving off certain hormones, which we'll talk about more in another unit, but like adrenaline or epinephrine, norepinephrine, so it starts pumping that out as well. All right, so any questions, just jump in. So the senses, this is where I feel like it starts to get a bit muddy in our textbook anyway. So some things to keep in mind. So it starts off giving like a review of sensory input. So our 5 senses take in stimulus around us, which then gets converted to an electrical signal that can be sent to our brain. So that's actually called sensory transduction. So that's like you're eating a very sweet popsicle. That popsicle is sweet, so that's a chemical that you're experiencing by your sensory cells. And that chemical is actually being translated into an electrical signal being brought to your brain that tells you it's sweet. So that's sensory transduction. Receptor potentials. So this is similar to what I just talked about for neurons, like resting potential. So as these as these cells are stimulated, they have the same changes in the membrane positive ions that will vary in intensity, and depending on the strength will be turned into an electrical signal. So don't stress too much about this type of diagram, but what it is showing is that sensory transduction that we just talked about. So the example here is a sugar molecule. There's a receptor on the cell that detects it. It goes through this process, and then this neurotransmitter is released, and it causes a action potential along the neuron so that our brain can detect that sugar molecule is actually there. So types of sensory receptors. What's the next question I have here? Okay. All right, so in your book it does talk about the various types. So this one is all showing within the skin as an example. So pain receptors, which you have here, and of course those are going to detect pain. Thermoreceptors. So thermoreceptors are would be like the hot and cold. Mechanoreceptors. So mechanoreceptors are ones that detect touch, pressure, motion, and sound. So light touch would be a mechanoreceptor. Strong pressure would be a mechanoreceptor. In a chemoreceptor, so that's not in this example, but I think it is on a different slide. So chemoreceptor is sensing for chemicals. For example, if you eat something really salty, detecting that salt would be a chemoreceptor. Then we also have electromagnetic, so these could be like, this would be light or electricity, so your eyes would have receptors happening there. So all of those different receptors combine to give us our 5 senses. So your book does talk about movement, so our nervous system controls all of it. Our muscles are connected to our skeletal system, and it's all controlled by our nervous system and various stimulus that happen there. See, this is where I find like this chapter gets weird, okay? Because it starts talking about the skeletal system when I feel like it could, be better suited somewhere else. But anyway, this is where they put it. So it's there to provide anchoring, so things like ligaments and muscles and things are attached to the skeletal system. So support. It's the whole reason we can stand and walk, and protection of internal organs, so things like our ribs and our hip bones, our pelvic girdle, protect what's happening inside there. So the skeleton is also divided into two sections, axial and appendicular. So axial skeleton consists of, any ideas? Skull, vertebral column, and ribs? Or is it the outer parts, the arm, leg, bones, pelvic girdle? Yeah, it is A. Axial skeleton is your skull, your spine, or your vertebrae, and your ribs. So it's the center part of your skeletal system. I think this is similar, similar to the diagram you have in your book. And the axial skeleton is the green pieces. Appendicular is yellow. So it also goes into different types of joints that you find within your body. It doesn't talk about all of them, but it does give a few. Any idea? So your hip bone, where your leg connects to your pelvis. Any idea what type of joint that is? That is correct, a ball and socket joint. Another place that exists is your shoulder. Suture joints are found along your skull bones. An example of a pivot joint is actually the fact that you can hold your forearm out and turn your hand up or down. That requires a pivot joint that's in your elbow. And a hinge joint would move like the hinge of a door, so being able to lift your arm up at the elbow, your lower arm up, that's a hinge joint. It has a good diagram in your book of that stuff. Oh, it's this one. Bones, so it just touches on bones and how they're made up. Don't stress too much over pieces of the bone, please, at this point in time. Like, you won't have to label this bone. So then it goes into the muscular system. So how, when nerves tell our muscles what to do, what exactly is happening within our muscles to allow that to happen, that movement to occur. And so that muscles contract and relax, and because they're connected to our bones, it allows that movement. So it's that interaction between muscle and skeleton that allows movement. So this is actually showing the bicep muscle contracting, which will lift your forearm up. And then the tricep muscle, when it contracts, that will bring your forearm back down. So kind of at the cellular level, this can be kind of confusing. Your book goes into crazy detail, way more detail than necessary for the muscle and how it works exactly. And so even it can be very confusing to read it. So I think the next slide gives a very kind of brief and to the point example of how this works, how the muscle actually contracts. And then I have a review question. So if you do those two things, we should be good. So a sarcomere, so that's the functional unit of a muscle. So this is a tiny little piece of the muscle that is actually causing the contracting to happen, is composed of regular arrangements of two kinds of filaments. So what are the names of these two kinds of filaments? B, you are correct. So there's thick filaments and thin filaments, and they're actin and myosin. Good. Okay, so here's my very brief description of how this works. So essentially, a myosin head, so myosin are these red guys right here, so these red guys in here. It has all kinds of little bumps or heads along that, and those little myosin heads attach to the actin, which is the blue. So the red piece attaches, the head of those attached to the blue, and it pulls them toward the center of the sarcomere. So these red guys pull these blue guys in toward the center like this, and that's actually what's causing the muscle to contract. Does that make sense? So sarcomere is the functional unit, and so those red guys are pulling the blue guys toward the center, which actually is the muscle contracting. So that's the very basic, tiny functional unit of the muscle. So that's as simplistic as I can get it. So this is something I always throw out there. I know this course does have a lot of assignments in it, but if you're looking for a bonus or you didn't do so great on some test or some other assignment, then maybe this is a good March break activity for you. It's just a mindfulness project, so you can pick some kind of practice that's often used to reduce stress. Could be maybe, and try doing something you don't regularly do now, like meditation or yoga. Do a little bit of research on how it's supposed to impact the body. So a very short write-up or video or some kind of PowerPoint you could do along with that about how it's supposed to impact the body, and then actually do it for 7 days. So kind of note any observations or maybe reflect a little bit over those 7 days. And then you can send it to me via email and I will put some points or something on something for you, okay? I said 1 point on your final grade, so that could be, you know, we could put points on something. I'm open to ideas on where you'd like that, if you want to do it. Any questions? And then I have a bunch of review questions for you. Nope, nothing? All right, let's get some questions here. I'm very hungry. I need supper. All right, first question. What is the functional unit of a muscle fiber? So this one might be, you can click right on the screen for these. This one could be fresh in your mind. All right, we have a bit of a split, but most people said sarcomere, and that is correct. So the sarcomere was the functional unit, and then the thick and thin filaments made up inside of it. So sarcomere was the answer. Next question. The hip and shoulder can move in most directions thanks to this type of joint. Everybody's getting this one. Ball and socket joint is correct. Which of the following describes a muscle contraction at the basic level? So myosin heads attach to actin filaments and pull them toward the sarcomere, or is it action heads That should say actin. Or is it actin heads attached to the myosin filaments? So which one had the head and which one didn't? Well, I failed at this one maybe. Oh, it's 50-50. Okay, so it is actually A, the first one, so it's the myosin heads. So the red piece has these little heads, the myosin that comes off of it. So myosin heads attach to the actin filaments and pull them toward the center of the sarcomere. So A is correct. So I failed you on that one. I apologize. Next. Question 4. Mechanoreceptors detect, so mechanoreceptors, heat or cold, touch or pressure, light energy, or chemicals. Good, most of you are getting it right. Mechanoreceptors detect touch or pressure. Okay, next. Thermoreceptors. So would that be heat and cold, touch or pressure, pain, or chemicals? You are correct. It's heat or cold for thermoreceptors. All right, let's keep going. Question 6. Your sympathetic nervous system has been activated. What effect might occur? Digestion is stimulated, decreased heart rate, decreased breathing rate, or epinephrine is released. So parasympathetic was rest and digest and heal, and sympathetic nervous system was fight or flight. So fight or flight has been activated. And you can change your answer if you want. So most of you get it right. Epinephrine is released. So sympathetic is fight or flight, and that's where you're getting epinephrine, which is adrenaline. The other ones are all associated with your parasympathetic. So your rest and digest and heal. All right, I think I have 12 questions here, so we're on to number 7. The peripheral nervous system is made up of 2 parts. So motor and autonomic, parasympathetic and sympathetic, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, or sensory and motor. I'm just trying to find the page for this for you guys here. I don't remember where it is. You guys got it right anyway here. Yep. Okay, motor and autonomic. So it's what we can control and what we can't. All right. Question 8. Which of the following types of personal characteristics are based in the cerebral cortex? Math skills, imagination, artistic talent, language skills, all of the above. So cerebral cortex, that's the outer layer of your brain. The main part of your brain, the outer layer. You guys are correct. It is all of the above. All right, question 9. Use the numbers below to provide a correct order of events in the propagation of a nerve signal. So you have to, in a question like this, you have to think, okay, which one's going to come first? So we know a stimulus has to happen first, right? So we know it's going to start with a 2. So what happens directly after that stimulus happens? So directly after that, it's going to be the small number of positive ions rush in. And then action potential is reached. And then more positive ions rush in, causing the signal to continue along the axon. And then it returns to resting potential at the end. So you guys got it right there. 2, 3, 1, 4, 5. Because it's always going to start with the stimulus first. Oops. Next. What is the main function of the hypothalamus within the brain? So I did point this out a little bit. Does it control breathing, coordinate body movements, regulate body temperature, or is it the control center for homeostasis? It also controls the pituitary gland. Good. You guys have good memories. Homeostasis is right. Question 11, 2 more. What causes the inside of a membrane to become positively charged during an action potential? So what's happening? Does it have to do with negative ions or positive ions, and are they rushing in or out? Wonderful. Positive ions are rushing in. That's what causes the inside to become positively charged for an action potential. Very good. One more. Which of the following carry incoming messages toward the cell body of a neuron? So think about when we looked at the neuron, the direction that the signal was passing, and what is actually carrying it in toward the cell body. You guys are correct. It's the dendrites. Good. So that's all of the review questions and kind of review of that chapter. Now I didn't speak on, quite a few things that are in this chapter, including a lot of detail on the eyes, and I don't even know what else. There's a lot of things that the eye is a big one. So try not to get too bogged down in the chapter. It has a lot of details that are actually not really necessary. So if I didn't point it out in here and you don't know about it, you'll probably still be okay. Any questions? Because that's all I have. So I'll answer any questions and then we will wrap it up. Let me make sure I have you on 3, 4, 5. Yep. This is the biggest turnout for a Skype session. You guys feeling nervous about this one, or just everyone was bored on a Tuesday? Well, I'm glad you could join us. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. That's good. I'm glad to have you guys. I'm glad to not talk to myself for 50 minutes.